At the hall's far end, elevated on a dais of 7 black marble steps, sat the throne of Ethel. It was not an ornate thing of gold and velvet, but a severe chair of pitted grey iron, reputedly forged from a fallen star. And in it sat Emperor Valerius, a man who seemed less to occupy the throne than to be a part of its geological certainty. Ilara Vane stood apart from them, a small, solitary figure in the undyed wool of a junior archivist. She had no place in this rigid formation. She was a tool, summoned for a function. Her purpose was to stand beside a low lectern, upon which rested the original charter of the Outer Vales, a brittle, 1,000-year-old scroll whose faded script was the subject of the day's proceeding. She was not a participant, she was an exhibit, the living proof of the document's authenticity. For an hour, she had listened as the Imperial Chancellor, a man with a voice as dry as dust, read the proclamation. It was called the Concordance of the Vales, and it was a masterpiece of rhetorical violence. It spoke of unity, of strength, of shared destiny. It used words like integration and harmonization. It did not use the words annexation or subjugation. With meticulous legalistic precision, it reinterpreted the ancient charter, twisting its promises of autonomy into a mandate for absolute imperial control. The Vales, a string of semi-independent territories that had pledged fealty but not sovereignty, were to be fully absorbed into the empire. Their laws would be nullified, their councils dissolved. Ilara felt the weight of the scroll beside her. She had spent her life among such documents. She knew their feel, their scent, the cadence of their language. The charter promised the people of the Vales the right to their own laws and traditions in exchange for guarding the empire's northern frontier. It was a contract sworn on the honor of the first emperor. The Concordance did not reinterpret that contract. It broke it. When the Chancellor finished, a profound silence descended once more. This was the moment of ritual, the final seal on the proclamation. Emperor Valerius leaned forward, a minute shift that sent a ripple of tension through the hall. His voice was not loud, but it filled the vast space, a low resonance that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. Archivist Ilara Vane. Ilara's head lifted. She had been expecting to be dismissed, to fade back into the quiet irrelevance of her archives. His eyes, the color of winter twilight, found her across the expanse of polished floor. They were not cruel eyes, but they were utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man who sees the world as a set of problems to be solved. The historical record has been honored by your presence, he stated. It was not a compliment. It was a declaration of fact. The past now yields to the present. The Vales are brought into the fold for the security and prosperity of all. This concordance ensures it. Let this act be sealed with the consent of history itself. Kneel, Archivist. The command was absolute, as simple and undeniable as gravity. It was not directed at her, Ilara Vane, the daughter of a bookbinder. It was directed at her function. He was ordering history to bend the knee. By kneeling, she would become the symbol of the past's submission to his will. The descent of the Vales, the whispers of broken oaths, all would be silenced by the sight of the keeper of the old law prostrating herself before the new one. Every eye in the hall was on her, waiting for the rustle of wool, the soft thump of knees on stone. It was a foregone conclusion, a formality. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last. The silence in the hall began to change. It was no longer the silence of discipline, but the silence of held breath, the silence of a drawn bowstring. Ilara did not move. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her body was a statue. She could feel the crushing weight of their collective gaze. "Kneel," it demanded. "Kneel and live. Kneel and let this moment pass." But the words of the charter were burned into her mind, as clear as if she had written them herself. "A promise given is a stone laid in the foundation of the empire. May it never be moved." She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting the emperor's across the cold, unforgiving distance. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout of defiance. It was quiet, calm, and exquisitely clear. It carried in the strained stillness, as if the hall itself were a whispering gallery designed for this single moment. "Your Majesty," she began, her tone respectful, yet unwavering. "The Imperial Charter, which every emperor since the first has sworn to uphold, promises protection to all subjects who honor their oaths to the throne. The people of the Vales have never broken their oath." She paused, letting the statement settle. Then she asked the question, "Does this concordance then release the throne from its own oath? Or does it affirm that a promise made by the emperor is a lesser thing than a promise made to him?" The universe stopped. The air in the Hall of Unification solidified. Breathing felt like a transgression. The generals' hands rested on the pommels of their swords, but they did not move. The ministers' faces, once so carefully blank, were now frozen in disbelief. They were staring not at the emperor, but at her, at this small, drab figure who had just, with a few calmly spoken words, taken a chisel to the very bedrock of imperial authority. The question was a perfect, terrible thing. It did not accuse him of being a tyrant. It asked him to define his own power. It laid two paths before him, each leading to a chasm. If he said his promise was lesser, he declared himself an oath-breaker, his honor meaningless. The foundation of fealty throughout the empire was honor, a sworn bond. If he admitted to breaking it, he invited every lord, every governor, every vassal to question their own allegiance. If he said the concordance released him from his oath, he proclaimed that his will was above the foundational law of the empire, the very law that gave him his throne. That was not monarchy. It was despotism, and it was a seed of rebellion. He could not answer. He could not ignore it. The silence that followed was a living entity, vast and suffocating. Ilara remained standing, her hands clasped loosely before her, her gaze locked on the man on the throne. She had not raised her voice. She had not insulted him. She had simply asked for clarity, and in doing so, she had checkmated a king in the middle of his court. Emperor Valerius did not move. His expression did not change. But Ilara saw something shift in the depths of his gray eyes. It was not anger. It was not shock. It was the cold, dispassionate glint of a master strategist encountering an unexpected move on the board. A move that did not challenge a piece, but the rules of the game itself. He was reassessing, calculating. The entire immense weight of his attention, an attention that could move armies and shatter nations, was now focused entirely on her, on the archivist who refused to kneel. Finally, he spoke. His voice cut through the paralysis, sharp and decisive, a tool to restore order. "The query is intricate," he said. The word intricate, a chilling understatement. He did not look at Ilara now, but swept his gaze over the frozen faces of his court. "It touches upon the deepest strata of imperial law. Such matters are not for the theater of ceremony. He was taking control not by answering the question, but by classifying it. He was moving it from the public square to the locked chamber. "The concordance is ratified," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Its implementation, however, will be subject to a thorough juridical review to ensure its harmony with the entirety of the Imperial Charter. He had not retreated, but he had created a delay, a space in which to maneuver. The archivist's insight has proven unexpectedly valuable. She will assist the Chancellery in this review. A collective, silent exhalation swept the hall. The crisis had been averted, the ritual concluded, albeit clumsily. But everyone understood what had just happened. Valerius rose from the throne of Ethel. "This assembly is concluded." He descended the 7 steps, his tread measured and heavy. As he passed the lectern, he did not turn his head to look at Ilara, but his voice was a low murmur, meant only for her. "You have a dangerous mind, Archivist Vane. I suggest you learn to use it more carefully." It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact. And as Ilara watched him sweep from the hall, the sea of courtiers parting before him like water before a ship's prow, she understood that her life in the quiet, dusty archives was over. She had asked a question, and the Emperor had answered by placing a leash around her neck. The Emperor's leash was fashioned from silk and protocol. Ilara was not thrown in a dungeon. She was given chambers in the scriptorium wing of the Imperial Palace, a place of unnerving beauty and oppressive quiet. The rooms were spacious with a high arched window that overlooked the serene geometric perfection of the sovereign's garden. The furniture was dark, polished wood, the bed was soft, the water in the basin warm. It was a cage, but its bars were gilded with comfort and privilege. A stern-faced woman named Lyra, whose title was Keeper of Protocol, had explained the rules on the first day. Her voice was as starched as her grey uniform. "You are a guest of the Emperor," Lyra stated, her eyes cataloguing Ilara's simple wool dress with faint disapproval. "As such, you are afforded the protection and provision of the palace. You will have unrestricted access to the Imperial Library and the archives for the purpose of your assigned duty." "My assigned duty?" Ilara asked, her voice steady. "You are to assist the Emperor in the juridical review of the concordance. You will compile all relevant precedents, charters, and historical edicts. You will be on call to the Emperor at all hours. He requires clarity, and you will provide the materials for it." Lyra paused, her gaze hardening. "Your movements are confined to the scriptorium wing, the library, the archives, and the sovereign's garden. You will not enter the main palace, the court, or the administrative halls unless expressly summoned. You will speak to no one of your work or of the events in the Hall of Unification. You are not a prisoner, Archivist Vane, but you are not free. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Ilara said. The danger was not in the words, but in the space between them. She was under his protection, which meant she was protected from everyone but him. She was to assist him, which meant she was his tool. Her knowledge, once her private refuge, was now a resource to be mined at his command. He had not punished her. He had claimed her. The days that followed fell into a strange, suspended rhythm. Ilara spent her hours in the Imperial Library, a space even grander and more silent than the Hall of Unification. Its shelves soared into a vaulted darkness, holding the collective memory of 1,000 years. The air smelled of aging paper, leather, and dust, a scent that had always been a comfort to her. Now it felt different, The knowledge surrounding her was no longer a vast, explorable ocean. It was an armory, and she had been tasked with locating the one weapon that could be used against her own principles. She worked with a feverish diligence, driven by a cold, clear purpose. If the Emperor wanted clarity, she would give it to him. She pulled down dusty tomes, unrolled brittle scrolls, and translated passages from the High Ethelic of the First Empire. She compiled a formidable dossier of legal and historical precedent, every entry a testament to the sanctity of a sworn oath. She did not editorialize. She did not argue. She simply gathered the facts. The law, in its purest form, was on her side. The truth was on her side. She clung to that as a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood. She saw no one but Lyra, who brought her meals, and the silent, gray-robed librarians who moved like ghosts among the towering shelves. She was utterly isolated, adrift in a sea of imperial power. The name Ilara Vane was now a whisper in the corridors she was forbidden to walk, a problem being debated in councils she was not permitted to attend. She was a ghost haunting the palace, her only reality the words on the page and the ever-present knowledge that the Emperor was watching. The summons came a week after her arrival. Not a formal message, but a silent Imperial guard at her chamber door, his face hidden behind a polished steel mask. He did not speak. He simply beckoned. She was led through corridors she had only glimpsed, their walls hung with tapestries depicting the glorious, bloody history of the Empire. They ascended a spiral staircase, the air growing colder until they reached a heavy door of ironwood. The guard opened it and stepped aside. It was the Emperor's private study. The room was a stark contrast to the public grandeur of the palace. It was a space of function, not display. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling map of the Empire, a sprawling, intricate web of territories, trade routes, and garrisons. The other walls were lined with shelves, but these did not hold ancient history. They held tactical manuals, economic reports, census data, and engineering schematics. A large desk, carved from a single block of dark wood, was littered with documents, its surface a controlled chaos. The room smelled of ink, old leather, and the faint, clean scent of ozone from the storm that was gathering outside the tall, unadorned window. Emperor Valerius was not at his desk. He stood before the map, his back to her. He was not wearing his formal robes, but a simple, dark tunic that made him seem less like a monument and more like a man, a dangerously powerful man. "You have been diligent, archivist," he said without turning. His voice was quiet, conversational. It was a stark contrast to the resonant authority he projected in the hall. "I have done as I was instructed," Ilara replied, her hands clasped behind her back to stop them from trembling. He finally turned. His gray eyes were shadowed in the dim light, and they assessed her with an unnerving intensity. "You misunderstand. That was not an instruction. It was a question. What did you hope to achieve in the hall? A moment of public glory? The fleeting fame of a martyr?" The question was a probe, searching for a weakness, vanity, ambition, foolishness. Ilara met his gaze. "I hoped for clarity. The same clarity Your Majesty is now seeking in this review." A flicker of something, not quite amusement but a grudging respect, passed through his eyes. "You fence well with words, but do not mistake this for a duel of equals. You stand in this room by my grace. You draw breath by my grace. I am aware of my position, Your Majesty. Are you?" He moved from the map to his desk, his movements fluid and precise. He picked up a heavy, leather-bound report. "This is a dispatch from the Northern Vales. Since your query, there have been 3 riots in the town of Silver Creek. A tax collector was stoned. 2 of my legionaries were killed. The locals are quoting you. They speak of the archivist's question. They see you as a symbol." He dropped the report onto the desk. The sound was a dull thud and punctuation mark of finality. "Your principles have a body count, Ilara Vane." The use of her name was a deliberate intimacy, a tool to unbalance her. He was closing the distance, stripping away her formal title. Ilara's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain still. "The violence is regrettable, but it is not a result of my question. It is a result of the concordance. It is the cry of a people who believe their sovereign has broken his word. Their sovereign is preserving the stability of an empire that protects them from horrors you cannot imagine," he countered, his voice hardening. "The tribes of the unclaimed lands are stirring. The Eastern Dynasty builds new ships. The world is not a library, archivist. It is a storm. To navigate it, I must be able to trim the sails and sometimes to lighten the load. And the people of the Vales are the load to be lightened? They are one valley against the fate of 10 million souls," he said, his voice dropping to a low, reasonable tone. He was not shouting. He was reasoning with her, a far more insidious form of dominance. Their traditions, their autonomy, it is a luxury the empire can no longer afford. For the good of the whole, some parts must be sacrificed. That is the logic of rule. It is a logic you seem incapable of grasping." "I grasp a different logic," Ilara said, her own voice quiet but firm. "The logic of the law. The empire is not a scale where lives are weighed against each other. It is a structure built on a foundation of oaths. If you remove a stone from the foundation, you tell everyone that the structure is unstable. You invite them to test its strength. The riots in the Vales are not the end of this. They are the beginning." He stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. The only sound was the drumming of rain against the window pane. "You believe that," he said, more to himself than to her. "You truly believe that an abstract principle is more important than the concrete reality of a stable realm." "I believe they are the same thing," she replied. "A realm without principles is not stable. It is merely waiting to collapse." He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-streaked dark. "I have read your compilation. It is thorough. It is compelling. You have armed my enemies for me." "I have armed the law, Your Majesty." He turned back, a strange, weary light in his eyes. "The law is a tool, archivist, like a sword or a pen. It is meant to be wielded by those with the strength and wisdom to do so. It is not a god to be worshipped." "Then it is nothing," she whispered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "It is just a story we tell ourselves to hide the fact that there is only will, only power." For the first time, a genuine emotion broke through his control, a deep, profound frustration. "Yes," he said, his voice sharp. "Finally, you see it. There is only power, the power to hold the world together, the power to keep the darkness at bay. My power. And you, with your question, with your damnable principles, you are trying to unpick the seams of it all." He took a step towards her, and for the first time, Ilara felt a primal jolt of fear. He was taller than she had realized, his presence overwhelming in the confines of the study. "I could have you executed," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "A single word, and you would cease to exist. Your principles would die with you. The veils would be crushed, the concordance would be law, order would be restored. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not look away. She held his gaze, her own a reflection of his intensity. "You could," she agreed softly, "but the question would remain. You would have answered it with silence and with blood, and everyone would know what that answer meant." The tension in the room was a physical thing, a high-frequency hum that vibrated in her bones. He stood before her, the absolute ruler of the known world, his power checked by the moral force of a single, unarmed woman. He let out a slow, controlled breath, the anger receding, replaced by that familiar, chilling calculation. He stepped back, re-establishing the distance between them. "Go," he said, his voice flat. "Return to your work. Find me a solution, archivist. Find me a path through this thicket you have grown. Find me a way to have my concordance and my honor. Find me a way to be emperor and not the tyrant you imagine me to be." It was not a request. It was a command, and it was an admission. He, the emperor, had no answer. He had brought her here, not to punish her, but because he was trapped by her logic as surely as she was trapped in his palace. As Ilara walked back through the silent, torch-lit corridors, she understood the true nature of their conflict. It was not a battle of wills. It was a battle of realities, and the emperor, for all his power, was beginning to see the cracks in his own. The emperor's command to find a solution was a subtle poison. It shifted Ilara's role from passive resistance to active participation. She was no longer just the keeper of the truth. She was now tasked with finding a way to compromise it. The days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light in her high window. The library became her world, its silence a constant companion. She did not see the emperor again for 2 weeks, but his presence was. The emperor's command hung in the air of the study, a thing of iron and finality. It was not a question to be considered or a proposal to be debated. It was a restructuring of her reality. Find me an answer that gives me both annexation and honor, both the breaking of an oath and the preservation of the principle that made oaths sacred. He was commanding her to square a circle, to weave a rope from sand, and the silence that followed was the silence of a forge after the hammer's last strike, when the incandescent metal holds its new and terrible shape. Ilara did not respond. There was nothing to say. Her silence was not defiance now, but the vacuum left by a challenge so absolute it consumed all possible replies. Valerius watched her, his gaze not of a king upon a subject, but of a master artisan examining a peculiar and unexpectedly useful tool. He gave a minute, almost imperceptible nod to the Praetorian guards, who stood like statues of polished basalt by the door. The universe, which had stopped in the Hall of Unification and had fractured in this study, now resumed its motion, but on a different axis. The guards moved without sound, their armored feet making no purchase on the polished stone. They did not touch her, yet their proximity was a physical pressure, a cage of disciplined force that guided her from the room. She walked past the emperor, her eyes fixed on the grain of the dark wood of the door ahead. To look at him again would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of his command, a concession she was not yet prepared to make. They led her not back toward the public halls or down to the dungeons she had half expected, but into a different wing of the sprawling Imperial palace. The corridors here were narrower, the air still and cool, scented with old paper, binding glue, and beeswax. The light came from tall arched windows that overlooked a severe geometric courtyard, a space of raked gravel and strategically placed sterile topiary. There was no life there, only design. Her new world was a suite of rooms in the scriptorium annex. It was, she recognized with a cold, sinking clarity, a masterpiece of psychological containment. The main chamber was vast, with a ceiling high enough to feel like a private sky. Bookshelves of pale, almost white ash wood lined every wall, filled not with the gilded decorative volumes of a courtier's library, but with authentic working texts, histories, legal codices, philosophical treatises, atlases. A massive table of the same pale wood dominated the center of the room, its surface a pristine, empty battlefield. A comfortable bed was tucked into an alcove, and a small adjoining room held a bathing pool of dark, unadorned marble. It was a scholar's paradise, and it was a cage. The silence here was different from the pressured silence of the hall or the charged silence of the emperor's study. This was the profound, empty quiet of a sealed tomb, a quiet that drank sound and offered no echo. The guards posted themselves outside her door, their presence a constant, unspoken reminder of her status. She was the emperor's prisoner, and her prison was an arsenal of the very knowledge she revered. He had not just confined her body, he had confined her within the architecture of her own mind. For a long time, Ilara stood motionless in the center of the room, the sheer, oppressive luxury of her cell pressing in on her. The emperor's gambit was brilliant in its cruelty. He had not threatened her with pain or death, which her principles could have withstood. He had threatened her with complicity. He had made the stability of the realm, the lives of the rioting citizens in the Vales, contingent on her ability to subvert the very laws that gave that realm meaning. If she refused, the blood would be on her hands. If she succeeded, she would become the architect of the lie that legitimized tyranny. Her training, the deep and abiding discipline of an archivist, took over. It was the only anchor she had left. When faced with a universe of chaos, one begins by cataloging the pieces. She moved to the great table, her hands tracing its smooth, cool surface. She could not solve the moral paradox, not yet, but she could address the juridical one. She picked up a stylus and a fresh sheet of parchment, the crispness of the paper a small, solid certainty in a world of abstractions. Her handwriting was as it always was, clear, precise, and devoid of flourish. She was not writing a solution. She was writing a request. She wrote until the list was complete, a meticulous blueprint for the deconstruction of 1,000 years of law. She left the parchment in the center of the table. It was a move in a game she did not want to play, a question aimed not at an emperor, but at the silent, waiting archives. Hours passed. The light in the courtyard shifted from the cold white of midday to the bruised purple of dusk. A servant entered, silent as a moth, leaving a tray of food, simple, nourishing fare, not a feast, and lighting several tall, unscented candles. Ilara did not eat. She watched the list on the table, the black ink stark against the pale parchment. It felt like a confession. The response, when it came, was not in the form of a rumbling cart of scrolls, but in the person of a man. The door opened to admit a figure as polished and severe as the palace itself. He was tall and lean, dressed in the dark gray uniform of a high-ranking Imperial prefect, his silver hair cut short, his face a mask of courteous neutrality. "Archivist Vane," he said. His voice was a calm, level instrument. I am Prefect Kalen. The Emperor has assigned me as your liaison. Any requests you have will come through me. I am here to ensure you have everything you need to complete your task. Task. The word was so simple, so bureaucratic. It stripped the act of its moral horror and rendered it as a mere administrative duty. I have made a list, Ilara said, her own voice sounding small in the cavernous room. Kalen's eyes flickered to the parchment on the table. He walked over and read it, his expression unchanging. Ambitious, he commented, the word holding neither praise nor criticism. Some of these documents are held in the deepest vaults. The concordance itself has not been seen by human eyes in a century. The Emperor ordered a juridical review, Ilara stated, her voice gaining a sliver of its former firmness. A review is impossible without the primary sources. Of course, the prefect agreed smoothly. The Emperor appreciates thoroughness. The documents will be brought to you. They will not, however, leave this room. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the shelves. You are to be the sole reviewer. No other scholars, no scribes for consultation. Your work is to be yours alone. The isolation was absolute. She was to be a single point of failure or success. And the riots in the Vales? She asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. For the first time, a flicker of something other than placid efficiency crossed Kalen's face. It was not emotion, but the shadow of it, a momentary tightening around his eyes. The Imperial legions maintain order, he said, the sentence a perfectly constructed wall. The Emperor desires a swift and peaceful resolution. Your work is the foundation of that peace. He turned to leave, his duty done. At the door, he paused. The Emperor respects logic, archivist. He believes you are a person of principle. Do not mistake his command for a request to abandon your principles. He is asking you to find where they intersect with the needs of the Empire. The door closed and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Find where they intersect. It was the same command, merely phrased in the language of reason and compromise. But Ilara knew that some principles do not intersect with power. They are the lines that contain it. The first of the documents arrived an hour later, brought by two hulking praetorians who carried the lead-lined archival chests as if they were filled with air. They placed them on the floor, unsealed the heavy locks, and retreated, leaving Ilara alone with the ghosts of her ancestors. She began with the concordance of the Vales. The scroll was housed in a cedarwood cylinder, and the parchment was heavy, almost like thin leather, the ink a faded brown. As she unrolled it, the scent of time itself filled the room. Her fingers, trained to read the language of decay as much as the language of the script, traced the 1,000-year-old words. It was a simple document in its way, a pact of mutual defense and eternal fellowship between the first emperor and the free clans of the Vales. It spoke of honor, soil, and blood. It was an oath. She worked through the night, the candlelight making the shadows dance like specters on the walls. She moved from the concordance to the dense cross-referenced volumes of Imperial law. She was no longer a prisoner. She was an archivist at work, lost in the silent conversation between the past and the present. Her mind, sharp and analytical, sifted through clauses, precedents, and annotations, seeking a flaw, a loophole, a forgotten path. It was near dawn when the candle wax had pooled and hardened and the sky outside was a faint, bruised gray that she found it. It was not in the grand body of a law, but in a footnote, a tiny, almost insignificant annotation in a commentary on the annexation of the Sunken Isles during the reign of Emperor Valerius's great-grandfather. The case was obscure, a territorial dispute over a chain of uninhabitable islands, settled more by threat than by law. The annotation referenced a then controversial juridical theory, the doctrine of sovereign exigency. It posited that in a moment of true existential crisis, the sovereign's primary oath, to preserve the state itself, could be invoked to temporarily supersede all other oaths and treaties. The state's survival, the theorist argued, was the logical precedent upon which all other laws were built. Without the empire, its treaties were meaningless. The doctrine had been fiercely debated and ultimately discarded as a pathway to tyranny. It was a failed legal argument, a dead end in the history of imperial law. But it was not forgotten. Ilara stared at the text, at the spidery, faded script. It was a key. It was the intellectual framework for the argument Valerius wanted. He could declare the unrest in the Vales, which his own actions had provoked, an existential crisis. He could invoke sovereign exigency, annex the Vales to preserve the state, and claim he was not breaking his oath, but fulfilling a higher one. It was a perfect, terrible thing, a masterpiece of rhetorical violence. She had found him an answer. She had found him a weapon disguised as a principle. And as the first geometric shafts of morning light pierced the sterile courtyard outside her window, Ilara Vane understood that the Emperor had not commanded her to find a solution. He had commanded her to load the gun. Whether she handed it to him was still her choice. The words lay exposed on the aged vellum, a scar in the annals of imperial law. Doctrina exigentiae summae, the doctrine of sovereign exigency. It was not a footnote or a forgotten amendment. It was a foundational support beam, buried deep in the architecture of imperial power, unseen and unused for centuries. It posited that in a moment of existential threat to the stability of the empire, a threat determined solely by the sovereign, all oaths, treaties, and precedents could be suspended. The emperor's will would not merely become law, it would become a state of nature, raw and absolute, until the crisis was averted. Ilara Vane did not breathe. The air in the scriptorium wing, once merely quiet, had become a solid, unyielding medium. She had been tasked with finding a path of juridical review, a way to thread a needle through a tapestry of oaths. Instead, she had found a sword, and the Emperor had given her the whetstone of his own authority with which to sharpen it. The logic was a perfect, terrible engine. The concordance had created unrest. That unrest, fueled by her own public question, was now escalating into riots in the Vales. Valerius could declare this manufactured crisis an existential threat. He could invoke the doctrine, suspend the thousand-year treaty, and crush the Vales not as a tyrant breaking his word, but as a sovereign preserving the empire from a threat she had helped create. He would not be breaking the law. He would be fulfilling its most ruthless, secret function. Her search for a principle had led her to a mechanism for its annihilation. She rested her fingertips on the page. The vellum was cool and smooth, a dead thing, yet the text upon it felt alive, a nest of vipers coiled in the heart of the archives. This was the Emperor's true test. He had not asked her to find a loophole. He had tasked her with building him a bridge of legitimacy over a chasm of his own making, and he had trusted her scholarly integrity to find the strongest, most unassailable materials. He had judged her correctly. She had found them. A sound, subtle as a change in air pressure, drew her gaze from the book. The heavy door to her suite had opened. Prefect Kalen stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the muted light of the corridor. He did not enter immediately, but held his position, his stillness a form of inquiry. He was not a man who ever seemed to walk. He simply appeared where the Emperor's will required him. His presence was a punctuation mark at the end of an unspoken sentence. Finally, he stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click that seemed to seal the room from the rest of the world. He carried a single lacquered tray. Upon it sat not food, but a slim portfolio of dark leather. "A new summary from the Western Command," Kalen said. His voice was without inflection, the sound of gravel being poured carefully onto silk. He placed the portfolio on the edge of her vast, polished desk, a calculated distance from the ancient tome she was studying. He did not glance at the book, yet his awareness of it was a palpable force. The Emperor thought you would wish to remain informed of the consequences. The word was chosen with surgical precision. Consequences, not events or developments. He was naming her the cause. Ilara's hands remained on her desk, her posture betraying nothing. She felt his gaze, cool and analytical, assessing her. It was the gaze of a man who weighs souls as a grocer weighs grain. "Consequences are the children of actions, Prefect," she replied, her own voice steady. "One must be certain of the parentage." A flicker of something, not surprise, but perhaps acknowledgement, passed through his eyes. Indeed, the parentage of a question can be as clear as that of a decree. He had made the connection explicit. The archivist's question was the parent. The riots in the Vales were the offspring. She refused to open the portfolio. She knew what she would find: sanitized reports of burned granaries, of local militias clashing with Imperial patrols, of deaths numbered with cold, bureaucratic neatness. It was a document designed not to inform, but to wound. It was a tool of psychological pressure, as finely calibrated as any thumbscrew. "The Emperor's honor is a concept of state, archivist," Kalen continued, his tone shifting into the philosophical, a register he used when delivering a threat as if it were a lesson. "It is an instrument of stability. When a lesser principle, such as an antiquated treaty, threatens that stability, a choice must be made. The Emperor believes in order. The law is the preferred method of maintaining it, but it is not the only one." There it was, the pragmatic heart of Valerius's philosophy delivered by his most impassive servant. The law was a convenience. Order was the necessity. He was giving her the chance to align the two. If she refused, he would simply discard the convenience. Ilara slowly drew her hands back from the ancient text, folding them in her lap. She looked at Kalen, truly looked at him for the first time. Not as a jailer, but as a component of the vast Imperial machine. His face was a mask of disciplined neutrality, but his existence was a testament to a certain kind of faith, a belief in the system he served, in the cold, hard logic of its survival. "Tell me, Prefect," she asked, her voice quiet but resonant in the oppressive silence. "The archives hold innumerable records of Imperial oaths. They are the bedrock upon which the children of the first Emperor built this world. If the sovereign himself can declare them void by an act of will, what is the value of the bedrock? What does the Empire stand on then?" She was not asking for information. She was testing the foundation of his own belief. She was holding up a mirror to the nihilism of his argument. Kylan's expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness did. It became heavier, charged with the weight of an unwelcome truth. "It stands on the Emperor, archivist Vane," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a trace of something other than neutrality. It was a sliver of cold, hard certainty, the sound of a man stating the fundamental axiom of his universe. "It has always stood on the Emperor." The universe stopped. The logic was unassailable because it was not logic at all. It was a declaration of faith. Their entire conversation, the pretense of law and principle, was a performance. For Valerius and for Kalen, the ultimate truth was power itself. The Emperor was the bedrock. Ilara had been trying to win a game of chess, but her opponent was willing to burn the board to claim victory. The doctrine she had discovered was not a hidden rule of the game. It was a license to start the fire. "Thank you, Prefect," she said, the words tasting of ash. "You have provided a great deal of clarity." He gave a slight formal bow of his head. He had delivered his message and assessed her state. His function was complete. Without another word, he turned and walked to the door, his footsteps making no sound on the thick carpets. He exited as he had arrived, a phantom of imperial will, leaving behind only the portfolio, a paper testament to the blood being shed, and a silence that was now filled with the chilling clarity of her choice. She was alone again. The geometric shafts of late afternoon sun sliced across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like frantic tiny ghosts. Her gaze fell once more upon the open book. Doctrina Exigentiae Summae. To give it to him was to become his accomplice, to provide the intellectual justification for tyranny. She would be the archivist who armed the executioner with a righteous blade. Her name would be a curse in the Vales for 1,000 years. To withhold it was to do nothing. Valerius would act anyway, his authority uncloaked by legal fiction. The Vales would burn, and her principles would be a cold comfort to the dead. She would have preserved the sanctity of the law in theory while allowing it to be rendered meaningless in practice. She would have kept the temple pure while the city around it was razed. Both paths led to the same destination for the people of the Vales. The only variable was her own complicity. The Emperor was not asking her to save the Vales. He was asking her to save the idea of the empire, even at their expense. He was asking her to choose order over justice, the system over the people. He was asking her to join him. With a slow, deliberate movement, Ilara reached for the ancient tome. Her fingers, stained with the faint scent of dust and crumbling paper, closed around the edge of the vellum page. It was thin, fragile, yet it held the weight of a kingdom. For a long moment, she simply held it, feeling the terrible power thrumming within the silent inscribed words. Then, with the precise, careful motion of a scholar preserving a text, she lifted the single folio out of the book's binding. The stitches were old, and the page came free with a soft, tearing whisper that sounded like a final breath. She held the doctrine in her hand. It was no longer part of a book. It was a separate thing now, a weapon unsheathed, a choice made manifest. She had not decided whether to give it to him, but she had isolated it, acknowledged it for what it was. She had curated the means of destruction. And in the gilded silence of her cage, she sat, holding the fate of the Vales between her thumb and forefinger, and waited for the Emperor to ask for it again. The doctrine of sovereign exigency lay open on the dark wood table. It was not a grand, illuminated manuscript, but a spare, functional text. Its iron gall ink faded to the color of old blood on the heavy vellum. The script was precise, the logic it contained as clean and as cold as a headsman's axe. Ilara Vane had found it. She had succeeded. The thought landed not with the triumph of discovery, but with the hollow impact of a coffin lid closing. For a long moment, she did not move. The silence of the scriptorium, once a comforting blanket of scholarly peace, had become a physical pressure against her ears. It was the silence of a vacuum, the absolute stillness that precedes a catastrophic collapse. She had been sent into the labyrinth of Imperial law to find a path for the Emperor, and she had returned with a map to its utter demolition. The doctrine was a masterpiece of rhetorical violence. It argued that in a moment of true existential crisis, a threat to the very structure and continuity of the empire, the sovereign was not merely permitted, but obligated to act beyond the established framework of treaties and laws. The oath of the emperor was to the empire itself, a living entity, and not to the static, written promises made in its name. A treaty, it posited, was a contract with a foreign power. The survival of the state was a covenant with destiny. The latter superseded the former, always. It was the perfect weapon. It gave Valerius not just an excuse, but a mandate. He could declare the unrest in the Vales, the unrest he himself had provoked, an existential crisis. He could then suspend the 1,000-year treaty not as an act of dishonorable pragmatism, but as a solemn, necessary duty. He would not be an oath-breaker. He would be a savior. And she, Ilara Vane, the quiet archivist who believed in the sanctity of a promise, would be the one to hand him the justification. The irony was a physical acid in her throat. She had sought to defend the integrity of the law, and in her exhaustive, principled search, she had unearthed the legal argument for its irrelevance. She had been checkmated by her own reverence for the complete historical record. Her fingers traced the edge of the vellum. The material was cool and smooth, an inert thing that held the potential for immeasurable suffering. To give this to him would be an act of profound complicity. It would make her the architect of the Vale's subjugation, her name a footnote in the legal history of their fall. To withhold it, however, was a futile gesture. The emperor would proceed regardless, his actions nakedly brutal, his hands unburdened by even the pretense of honor. The people of the Vales would still be crushed, but their defiance would be framed as senseless treason against a patient emperor who had exhausted all legal avenues. At least with the doctrine, the world would see the chilling logic of his tyranny, the formal structure of his betrayal. Was there a difference between being the hand that sharpens the blade and being the witness who watches it fall? The question was a schism in her soul, splitting her duty to truth from her duty to humanity. But the people of the Vales were not an abstraction. They were the faces she saw in the grain of the wood, the phantom cries she heard in the oppressive quiet. They had made her a symbol, a flicker of hope that the empire's vast grinding machinery could be stalled by a single, immovable principle. If she now provided the very grease for those gears, what would their sacrifice have meant? The air in the room shifted. It was a minute change, a subtle displacement, but after days of monastic solitude, her senses were honed to a fine edge. Prefect Kalen stood in the archway, a figure of grey wool and colder silence. He did not seem to have walked there. He seemed to have coalesced from the shadows, his presence an instantaneous fact. He moved with a liquid quiet that was more unnerving than the tread of an armed guard. His eyes, the color of wet slate, flickered from her face to the open text on the table. He did not need to read it to understand its significance. Her posture, The rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hand rested near the scroll as if to protect it or to smother it. It was all the answer he needed. "The Emperor grows impatient," Kalen said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous space, a flat, toneless statement that carried the weight of an ultimatum. "The situation in the Vales deteriorates. The rioters have a name they chant now. Yours." Ilara felt the words like a physical blow. It was the move she had anticipated, the turning of the screw. He was reminding her that this was not a theoretical exercise. Her silence, her deliberation, had a cost measured in blood. "The archives are vast," she replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of the fracture within her. 1,000 years of jurisprudence is not easily untangled. Kalen took a step into the room. The polished floor drank the faint light, leaving his form dark and indistinct. "But you are a prodigy of the archives, are you not? That is what they said, that you see the patterns others miss, that you hear the echoes in the law." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Have you found nothing, archivist? No precedent? No obscure clause? No doctrine that might speak to our present exigency?" The word hung in the air between them. Exigency. He knew. Or if he did not know the specifics, he knew the shape of what she had been tasked to find. He was not asking a question. He was demanding a report. This was the moment. The precipice. She could lie, claim failure, and seal her own fate, and likely the Vales, in a storm of overt violence. Or she could speak the truth and become an accomplice. Her mind, a machine built on logic and precedent, offered a third path, the path of the archivist. She was not a creator of law, nor its judge. She was its custodian. Her duty was not to interpret or conceal, but to present. The choice to use the doctrine, the moral weight of its deployment, belonged to the one who wielded power. It belonged to the Emperor. "I have found a relevant text," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She was merely cataloguing a discovery. A theoretical framework from the age of the unifiers. It is called the doctrine of sovereign exigency. A flicker of something, not surprise, but a deep and chilling confirmation, passed through Kalen's eyes. It was the look of a man whose master's gambit had paid off perfectly. Valerius had not sent her on a search. He had sent her on a test. He had wagered that her intellect and her principles would lead her precisely to this terrible place. Kalen gave a slow, minute nod. He did not smile. His features were incapable of such warmth. "You have fulfilled your duty to the archive, then." The words were a pronouncement, a closing of some invisible ledger. "The Emperor will see you now." It was not a request. It was an alteration of her reality. The time for study was over. "Bring the text," Kalen added, his gaze falling once more upon the scroll. Ilara's hands moved with a deliberate, almost dreamlike slowness. She rolled the vellum scroll, its surface cool against her fingertips. The weight of it seemed to increase tenfold as it formed a tight cylinder. This was it. The collected sum of her knowledge, her principles, her defiance, all of it now contained in this single, portable object of destruction. She slid it into a plain leather document case, the clasp clicking shut with a sound of utter finality. She rose from her chair, her spine straight. The gilded cage had served its purpose. It had focused her mind, isolated her from the world, and forced her to forge the very key that would unlock her own complicity. Kalen turned and began to walk, expecting her to follow. Ilara fell into step behind him, the leather case clutched in her hand. They moved through the silent, opulent corridors of the scriptorium wing, their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpets. They were not walking toward the grand hall of unification, but to a part of the palace she had never seen. The Emperor's private wing, the heart of the machine. With every step, she felt the weight of the scroll in her hand. It was no longer just a legal theory. It was a confession. It was a sentence, and she was the one about to deliver it. The summons had been a formality. Ilara had felt its inevitability coalesce in the oppressive quiet of the scriptorium wing, a certainty as solid as the granite walls that held her. Prefect Kalen did not knock. His presence simply manifested at her door, a subtle shift in the composition of the silence. He stood as a figure of perfect neutrality, his face a mask of bureaucratic dispassion, and inclined his head. The gesture was not a request. It was a closing parenthesis. Walking behind him, Ilara was acutely aware of the scroll in her hand. The cylinder of vellum, tied with a simple leather cord, felt disproportionate in its weight, as if it had absorbed the gravity of the legal precedent it contained. It was cold and heavy as a magistrate's rod, a tool of judgment she had unearthed and was now being compelled to deliver. She was a weapon being carried to its master. The journey through the palace was a descent through layers of power. The gilded filigree and lush tapestries of her residential wing, the architecture of comfortable confinement, gave way to the severe, functional heart of the Imperial core. Carved acanthus leaves yielded to unadorned, polished obsidian. The light, once soft and diffuse, grew more severe, falling in geometric shafts that bisected the long, echoing corridors. The air itself changed, losing the dry, papery scent of the archives and taking on a faint, metallic tang, the smell of ozone and cold steel. It was the atmosphere of a place where decisions were not merely considered, but executed. They did not proceed to the Hall of Unification, the theater of public power. Kalen led her to a section of the palace she had only read about, the Emperor's private chancellery. The guards at the final door were of the Presidium Guard, their burnished gray armor drinking the light, their stillness absolute. They did not challenge Kalen, but their eyes, slits in emotionless helms, tracked Ilara with an unnerving intensity. They were not guarding a man. They were guarding the structural anchor of their world. The door opened, not into a throne room, but into what could only be described as a command center. The vast, circular chamber was dominated by a colossal table of dark, veinless stone. Upon it lay not a map of the empire, but a dozen maps, layered and cross-referenced with translucent overlays marked with tactical symbols. Reports bound in gray leather were stacked in precise geometric piles. There was no gold, no art, no concession to luxury. The room was a pure expression of its purpose, the management of an empire. It was Valerius's mind given physical form, and there he was, not seated on a throne, but standing over the table, one hand resting flat upon a strategic map of the outer veils. He wore simple, unadorned black, his presence a point of geological certainty around which the entire room seemed to pivot. He did not turn as she entered. He simply spoke, his voice the same low resonance she remembered, a sound that did not need volume to command the absolute attention of a space. Archivist Vane. Prefect Kalen guided her to the opposite side of the table and then, with a silent bow, receded into the shadows by the door, becoming once more a part of the architecture. The Emperor finally looked up. His eyes were not cruel or angry. They were the eyes of a master strategist assessing a complex variable, impersonal, analytical, and possessing a terrifying depth. He gestured to the scroll in her hand. "You have found something," he stated. It was not a question. Ilara's throat was dry. She held her own gaze steady, a small act of defiance in a universe of his design. "I have, Your Majesty." "I did not ask for a discovery," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "I asked for a justification. Explain it." This was the test, not just what she had found, but how she would frame it. He was asking her to articulate the logic of his tyranny. Drawing a slow breath, she chose her armor, the dispassionate precision of her profession. "It is a legal theory from the scholastic age preceding the Concordance of Thorns," she began, her voice clearer and steadier than she expected. "It is called the doctrine of sovereign exigency. It posits that the first and most inviolable duty of the sovereign is the preservation of the state itself. This duty, the doctrine argues, is the foundational axiom from which all other laws derive their legitimacy." She paused, watching his face. It was utterly still, an unreadable mask of granite. "The doctrine asserts," she continued, "that in a time of true existential crisis, invasion, systemic collapse, a threat to the fundamental integrity of the empire, the sovereign's primary duty supersedes all other compacts, treaties, and even long-standing internal laws. To preserve the whole, the sovereign may be required to amputate a part. The treaty with the Vales, therefore, could be set aside if it threatens the stability of the larger imperial body." Valerius nodded slowly, a minute shift of his head that carried the weight of a tectonic plate. "An existential crisis," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the map of the rioting Vales. "The chaos you initiated, the fracturing of order. It would seem the conditions are met." The accusation was delivered with the coldness of a medical diagnosis. He was making her a co-conspirator in the crisis he intended to solve. The blood rushed in her ears, but her voice remained level. "The doctrine is specific on this point, Your Majesty," she said, the words sharp and clean as shards of glass. "The exigency must be authentic. It cannot be manufactured to serve as a pretext. It must be a genuine threat to the whole, not a consequence of the sovereign's own actions." She had done it. She had drawn the line. She had handed him the sword, but pointed out the flaw in its hilt. For the first time, a flicker of something that was not pure calculation crossed the emperor's face. It was not anger. It was closer to weariness, a profound, ancient exhaustion. He let out a soft, humorless breath that was not quite a sigh. "You are magnificent, archivist," he said, the words devoid of warmth. "You see the architecture of the argument perfectly. You see the load-bearing walls and the weak points. You believe I manufactured this crisis to break a treaty." He straightened up from the table and walked around it, his steps silent on the stone floor. He stopped, not in front of her, but beside her, so they were both looking down at the maps. "You see this?" he said, tapping the border of the outer Vales. "A rebellious province, a broken oath. You see it in 2 dimensions. Allow me to add a third." With a precise movement, he lifted the overlay of the Vales. Beneath it was a different map, one she did not recognize. It showed the far northern frontier of the empire, a vast, desolate expanse of mountains and frozen plains. But this map was not empty. It was covered in stark, crimson symbols that moved inward like a tide. Arrows, pincer formations, estimates of force concentrations. "This," Valerius said, his voice a low, chilling whisper, is the Zealand ascendancy. While my nobles squabble over tariffs and my merchants count their coin, the ascendancy has spent 3 generations forging a state dedicated to a single principle: ideological purification through conquest. They do not want our resources. They want our ashes. They will be at the Frostfang Peaks within 2 years. The universe of the room tilted. The riots, the treaty, her question, it all shrank, recontextualized by this terrifying new reality. The outer veils, the Emperor continued, his finger tracing the mountain range that separated the province from the rest of the empire, are our only viable strategic bulwark. Their independent militias are ceremonial. Their fortresses are antiquated. To hold the north, I must federalize their chain of command, modernize their garrisons, and integrate their infrastructure. I must have absolute control. The treaty made that impossible. The treaty was a guarantee of our annihilation. He looked at her, and for a moment, the Emperor was gone, and she saw only a man burdened by an impossible strategic problem. You asked me in the hall if my oath was less binding than an oath made to me, he said. I will answer you now. My highest oath is not to a piece of paper 1,000 years old, nor even to the people of the Vales. It is to the 500 million souls who live behind that wall, an oath to their continued existence. The doctrine of sovereign exigency is not a pretext, archivist. It is my only remaining path. He stepped back, the mask of the Emperor settling back into place. The moment of unnerving intimacy was over. The silence that filled the room was heavier than before, filled with the ghosts of millions. Ilara stood frozen, the scroll a dead weight in her hand. She had come to debate a principle of law. She was being shown the calculus of extinction. You have given me the juridical framework, Valerius said, his voice once more the instrument of command. Now you will give it form. You will not simply surrender that scroll. You will take it, and you will author the Imperial Proclamation of Annexation. You will cite the doctrine. You will lay out the legal argument in your own precise, unimpeachable language. You will give my actions the weight of law, authenticated by the very archivist who first challenged them. He was not asking her to be a scribe. He was ordering her to be the high priestess of his heresy, to use her devotion to the sanctity of the law to sanctify its violation. Prefect Kalen stepped forward from the shadows, placing a fresh stack of vellum and an inkwell on a nearby writing desk. The tools of her trade, now instruments of her damnation. The Emperor turned his back to her, once more facing his maps of a world on fire. Begin, he commanded the empty air. Ilara stood alone in the center of the room, trapped between the man who would save the empire by breaking it and the terrible, perfect logic of the law she had just handed him. She was no longer the keeper of the empire's memory. She was being ordered to become the architect of its justification. The command did not land like a physical blow. It was finer, sharper, a sliver of ice inserted directly into the core of her being, freezing the frantic machinery of her thoughts. The Emperor had not merely presented her with a choice. He had presented her with the architecture of her own damnation. To refuse was to condemn 1 billion souls to fire and ruin. To accept was to personally author the death of principle. To take the pure, unassailable truth of the law and twist it into a weapon of subjugation. The silence that followed his words was different from the one in the Hall of Unification. That had been a silence of pressure, of held breath and monolithic authority. This was the silence of a vacuum, the dead quiet of space between dying stars, punctuated only by the low, indifferent hum of the command console. The blinking red lights of the Zealand fleet on the star chart were no longer abstract data points. They were the rhythmic heartbeats of an approaching apocalypse. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the tactical display. The intricate dance of light and shadow was a map of her own entrapment. She had walked into this room seeking the logic behind an act of tyranny and had found it. The logic was flawless, terrifying, and absolute. It was the logic of the surgeon who amputates a limb to save a life, the cold calculus of sacrificing the few to preserve the many. But a limb is not a people. A treaty is not a tumor, and she was not a surgeon. She was a keeper of oaths. "I am not asking for your approval, archivist." The Emperor's voice was a low, conversational current in the silent room, stripping the moment of its grand historical weight and rendering it a simple, brutal transaction. "I am requisitioning a resource. Your name, your reputation for unimpeachable integrity is now a strategic asset of the Empire. You have become a symbol of the law's sanctity. Therefore, you are the only one who can grant this act the legitimacy it requires to be accepted. Without a civil war, we cannot afford to fight." He gestured to the star chart, his movement economical and precise. "The lords of the central domains are restless. They see my move against the Veils as a precedent that could be used against them. They whisper of rebellion. But if Ilara Vane, the woman who defied me on principle, authors the proclamation, if she, in her own hand, codifies the doctrine of sovereign exigency as necessary and just, their whispers will die. Their resistance will collapse. They will see it not as tyranny, but as a terrible necessity vouched for by the law's most fervent disciple. You will be the shield that protects my flank, allowing me to turn and face the true enemy." Every word was a masterpiece of rhetorical violence, dismantling her identity and repurposing its pieces for his war machine. Her courage in the hall, her unwavering belief in the sanctity of oaths. He was not punishing her for them. He was harnessing them. He had seen the power of her conviction and, like any good strategist, had immediately calculated how to turn his opponent's strength to his own advantage. Her mind, a library of precedents and principles, raced to find an escape. A third path. There was none. The universe of their reality had been compressed into this single binary choice. She could preserve her own moral purity, her own soul, and in doing so, become a silent accomplice to the Empire's annihilation. Or she could sacrifice her soul to save the lives of millions who would never know the cost. Her name cursed for 1,000 years as a byword for betrayal. In the minds of the people of the Veils, her name was a shield. Valerius was commanding her to reforge it into a cage and then hand him the key. She finally lifted her eyes from the map of their doom and looked at him. She saw no flicker of malice, no gloating triumph. His face was a mask of cold, weary resolve. He was a man trapped by the same terrible logic that now imprisoned her. A man who had made his peace with becoming a monster to prevent the rise of something worse. He had shouldered the burden of his own damnation long ago. Now he was merely asking her to share the weight. "The doctrine of sovereign exigency," she heard herself say, her voice a foreign sound, thin but not frail, like a single thread of spun steel drawn taut across the abyss. "It allows for the suspension of law in the face of an existential threat." "It does," Valerius affirmed, his gaze unwavering. He recognized the shift in her tone not as surrender, but as the beginning of a negotiation. It does not, however, grant the sovereign the right to permanently nullify those laws, only to set them aside for the duration of the exigency, she continued, her mind latching on to the fine print, the juridical nuance that was her only remaining territory. It is a temporary measure for a temporary crisis. A minute shift in the emperor's posture told her he understood where she was going. The crisis is the continued existence of the Zealan ascendancy. It is not temporary. The imminent invasion is the crisis, Ilara corrected him, her voice gaining a fraction more substance. The doctrine is a shield, not a sword. It is meant to preserve the body of the state, not to permanently amputate its limbs or rewrite its genetic code. The veils are a part of that body. You are not annexing them for power. You are, by your own logic, placing them under Imperial military command for the defense of the whole. The air in the room grew denser. Prefect Kalen, who had remained as still as a statue carved from shadow, seemed to recede even further, becoming nothing more than a peripheral presence. This was a dialogue between two poles of power, the absolute authority of the sovereign and the unyielding logic of the law. Your point, archivist? Valerius's voice was flat, devoid of impatience but carrying the immense weight of his focus. Ilara took a breath, the cold, sterile air a shock to her lungs. This was it, the fulcrum upon which her world and the world of the Veils would turn. She could not refuse the command, but she could define its terms. She could embed a seed of principle within the heart of this monstrous act. "I will write the proclamation," she said, and the words felt like stones in her mouth. She saw a flicker of something, not relief, but acknowledgement in the emperor's eyes. "I will invoke the doctrine of sovereign exigency. I will put my name to it, and I will lend your decree the legitimacy you require." She paused, letting the weight of her concession fill the room. "But I will not write a proclamation of annexation. That is a lie. I will write a proclamation of imperial mandate. I will state that the concordance of the Veils is suspended, not nullified. I will codify that their local laws, their traditions, and the rights of their people are to be preserved under the direct protection of the imperial throne for the duration of the Zealan threat. They will answer to your military commanders, but their cultural identity will remain intact, guaranteed by the very document that places them in bondage. When the threat is gone, if it is ever gone, the mandate will be subject to review. It will not be a permanent conquest." She held his gaze, her entire being focused into a single point of defiance. "You are requisitioning their land and their lives for a war. You will not also have their soul. That is my condition." For a long moment, the emperor simply watched her. He was weighing her, calculating. He was assessing the strategic value of her proposal versus its cost. He had asked her to build him a bridge of legitimacy, and she had agreed, but she was insisting on building it with her own materials, to her own design. It would still carry his armies, but it would also carry a promise, a temporary subjugation, guaranteed by imperial law, authored by their champion. Valerius mused, his voice a low rumble. He looked at the star chart, then back at her. It is a small price to pay for the compliance of an entire borderland and the stability of the inner domains. The distinction is semantic, but symbols have power. You have proven that. He gave a single, sharp nod. Your condition is accepted. Prefect Kalen will provide you with a scribe, a desk, and all the necessary materials. I want the draft by morning. The transaction was complete. The key had turned in the lock. Ilara did not feel relief. She did not feel victory. She felt a profound, hollowing cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had saved a principle, a sliver of law, a fragment of hope for a people who would still see her as their betrayer. But to do so, she had agreed to become the architect of their chains. Prefect Kalen stepped forward, his movements fluid and silent. "This way, archivist." As she turned to follow him, leaving the Emperor to his silent vigil over a galaxy of dying lights, Ilara Vane felt the true weight of her choice settle upon her. It was not the weight of the Empire, nor the threat of the Zealand fleet. It was the weight of the words she had not yet written, the ink that was not yet spilled. It was the weight of a future she had just condemned herself to create. It was done. The Emperor's words did not echo in the austere quiet of his command center. They were absorbed by the maps, the reports, the cold, functional steel of the room, just as the polished obsidian floors of the great hall had drunk the light. The agreement settled between them, not as a resolution, but as a change in pressure, a shift in the fundamental gravity of the world. The drawn bowstring of their confrontation had not been loosed. Its tension had merely been transferred from the Emperor to Ilara, a weight she now carried in the hollow of her chest. Valerius regarded her for a moment longer. The geological certainty in his gaze remained, but something new had been layered over it. The dispassionate assessment of a craftsman examining a newly acquired, highly specialized tool. He had not won a battle of wills, he had completed a transaction. He had acquired her integrity, and the price had been a single, conditional clause. "Prefect," the Emperor said, his voice returning to its low, resonant baseline. He did not turn. His focus remained on Ilara, pinning her in place. "Escort the archivist back to the scriptorium wing. Provide her with everything she requires: Imperial-grade vellum, the finest scribe's inks, access to the concordance of legal precedents, and the seal of mandate." He paused. "She is not to be disturbed." The final sentence was not for her comfort. It was a command to insulate his asset, to protect the delicate work of forging the Empire's most necessary lie. Prefect Kalen materialized from the periphery, his presence as seamless and silent as a change in the light. "At once, Your Majesty." There was nothing more to say. The universe of their negotiation had collapsed into a single, unalterable point of fact. Ilara gave a shallow automatic nod, a gesture that felt alien to her own body. She turned, and the movement was stiff, the motion of a joint long held in tension. As Kalen led her from the room, she did not look back at the man who had just made her an accomplice to the dismantling of a 1,000-year-old promise. She could still feel his gaze on her, a physical weight against her back, measuring her departure not as a retreat, but as the deployment of a strategic component. The journey back through the palace's arteries was a study in altered reality. The corridors, carved from the same cold gray granite, seemed to have changed their texture. Before, they had been the passages of a cage. Now, they felt like the interior of a weapon she was being forced to help build. The guards, clad in burnished steel, the color of a winter sky, were rigid and impassive as ever, yet their stillness felt different. It was no longer the vigilance of jailers guarding a dissident, but the formal quiet of an honor guard protecting a vital instrument of state. They were guarding the proclamation now, and she was merely the living vessel for its creation. Her footsteps, which had been defiant taps against the stone upon her arrival, were now soft, absorbed by the immense listening silence of the palace. Each step was heavier than the last, weighted with the words she had yet to write. The scriptorium wing was just as she had left it, a beautiful, sterile prison of gilded shelves and filtered light. But the oppressive quiet she had once found so isolating now seemed accusatory. The phantom sound of turning pages she had imagined before was gone, replaced by the ghost of a promise breaking. Within minutes, Kalen returned. He did not enter, but stood at the threshold, an embodiment of the invisible barrier that still defined her world. A palace functionary followed, a man with the face of a blank document, who laid out the promised materials on the great mahogany desk. A stack of vellum, its surface smooth and pale as bone. A crystal inkwell filled with ink so black it seemed to devour the light. A set of pens, their nibs sharpened to a lethal fineness. And last, placed with deliberate care in the center of the desk, was a heavy, circular object of dark, oiled bronze, the seal of mandate. It was reserved for decrees that superseded established law through sovereign will. It had not been used in 2 centuries. The functionary retreated. Kalen remained. "The Emperor is confident in your efficiency," the prefect stated. It was not praise, it was a recitation of an expectation. Ilara looked at the seal, at its intricate carving of a sunburst behind a balanced scale, the symbol of imperial power imposing order on the chaos of jurisprudence. "The Emperor's confidence is in the law he has commanded me to write, prefect." "Not in me." A flicker of something, not surprise, but perhaps analytical interest, passed through Kalen's eyes. "The law is a tool, archivist. Its efficacy depends entirely on the hand that wields it. You have proven your hand is precise." He gave a stiff, formal bow. "Your meal will be brought. As the Emperor commanded, you will not be disturbed." He departed, the door closing with a soft, final click that sealed her in with her task. She was alone with the architecture of her compromise. For a long time, she simply stood before the desk, the polished wood reflecting her pale, still form. This was the true crucible, not the public defiance in the Hall of Unification, nor the intellectual chess match in the Emperor's study. This was the moment of quiet, solitary creation, where the abstract principle of her bargain had to be rendered into the cold, unforgiving permanence of written law. Finally, she sat. The chair was cushioned with velvet, but it felt as hard as stone. She pulled the first sheet of vellum toward her. The blankness of it was a physical presence, a silent accusation. She was not merely an archivist retrieving a truth. She was an author creating a new one. She dipped the pen. The ink coated the nib, a drop of pure darkness clinging to the metal. Her first words would be the foundation of the entire edifice. They had to be perfect. They had to be strong enough to bear the weight of an empire, yet precise enough to contain the seed of its own dissolution. The promise of restoration. A proclamation of imperial mandate concerning the temporary suspension of the Treaty of the Veils. The words appeared on the vellum, stark and severe. They felt like a betrayal. The word temporary was her anchor, the single point of light in a document of profound darkness. But it looked so small, so fragile against the crushing weight of imperial mandate. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and precedent, began its work. She was no longer Ilara Vane, the junior archivist who believed in the sanctity of oaths. She was a juridical architect tasked with constructing a shelter in the midst of a hurricane. The structure had to be sound, even if its location was a moral wasteland. She wrote not of conquest, but of responsibility. She invoked Not the emperor's power, but the sovereign's duty, the ultimate unspoken oath to preserve the whole, even at the cost of its parts. She framed the annexation not as an act of aggression, but as a measure of protection, a drawing in of a vulnerable limb before the frostbite of an existential winter could claim it. She used the dry, dispassionate language of the doctrine of sovereign exigency, letting the cold logic of the ancient law do the brutal work. Each sentence was a carefully placed stone in a wall, sealing the Veils away from their freedom, but also, she told herself, sealing the empire away from its immediate destruction. Hours bled into one another. The geometric shafts of afternoon light faded, and servants entered silently to light lamps that cast a warm, golden glow on her monstrous work. They placed a tray of food beside her, but she did not see it. The universe had contracted to the space between her eyes and the page. The scent of ink was metallic and sharp, the only air she breathed. The scratching of the nib was the only sound, a lonely rhythmic erosion of 1,000 years of history. She wrote of the Veils' honored history, of their people's strength, framing their coming sacrifice as a testament to their loyalty, a loyalty that was about to be coerced. It was a masterpiece of rhetorical violence, cloaked in the language of reverence. She was hollowing out their autonomy while praising its beauty, preserving the shell while commandeering the soul. With every paragraph, a piece of her own integrity flaked away, turning to dust. Finally, as the first hints of a gray, pre-dawn light touched the high windows of the scriptorium, she wrote the last line. It was the clause she had fought for, the heart of her compromise, now codified in the unyielding language of Imperial law. And upon the certified cessation of the present exigency, this mandate shall be rendered void, and the full articles and dignities of the Treaty of the Veils shall be restored without amendment or delay by this same sovereign authority. She read it over. It was a perfect, terrible thing. It was legally unassailable, politically potent, and morally vacant. It would give the Emperor his fortress, the Veils their sliver of hope, and the Empire a chance at survival. And it would brand Ilara Vane forever as the woman who gave tyranny its most eloquent and effective voice. Her hand trembled as she reached for the seal of mandate. The bronze was cold and heavy, an anchor of power. She positioned it over the designated space at the bottom of the proclamation. For a moment, she hesitated, her own reflection looking up at her from the polished surface of the desk, a pale, exhausted ghost. Then, with the last of her strength, she pressed down. The seal sank into the hot wax, leaving its indelible mark. It was done. The proclamation was authentic. The lie was now law. She pushed the chair back and rose, her limbs aching with a profound weariness that went far beyond lack of sleep. The finished document lay on the desk, radiating a cold authority of its own. She walked to the tall, arched window and looked out. The sky was the color of ash and bruised plums. Below, the capital was beginning to stir, its people utterly unaware that the architecture of their world had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered while they slept. And she, Ilara Vane, was its silent, solitary architect. She had not been broken. She had been repurposed. The question that remained in the oppressive silence of her gilded cage was what would be built with her now. The agreement settled in the air between them, not as a relief, but as a weight. It was a structure of cold iron, forged in the last few minutes of desperate logic, and its mass seemed to press down on the very floor of the Emperor's study. The silence that followed was not the shocked vacuum of the throne room, but the dense, functional quiet of a transaction concluded. The universe had not stopped. It had merely shifted its axis, and Ilara Vane was the fulcrum. Emperor Valerius watched her, his gaze not triumphant, but appraising. It was the look of a master craftsman examining a tool that had proven unexpectedly, remarkably useful. He had not broken her. He had successfully repurposed her. His victory was not in her submission, but in her utility. "The proclamation of Imperial mandate," he said, the words a low resonance that gave the new reality its name. It is a fitting title. It acknowledges the necessity without erasing the history. He made a minute gesture with his hand, a signal to some unseen functionary. "You will be given what you require to draft it. The language must be precise. It must be unassailable. It must be yours." That final pronouncement was the locking of the cage. Her name, her reputation for unbending integrity, was to be the seal upon the document. She would not be a signatory hidden in a list of counselors. She would be its architect. The people of the Vales, who had whispered her name in defiance, would now read it as the justification for their subjugation. She had hoped to be a shield. Instead, she had become the most sophisticated weapon in the Emperor's arsenal. "I understand my role, Your Majesty," she said, her voice a model of composure. Inside, her thoughts were a maelstrom of cold, hard calculations. She had chosen the preservation of the whole over the sanctity of the part. It was the logic of a strategist, the logic of an emperor. The terrible irony was that in her defiance, she had come to think exactly like him. Prefect Kalen materialized at the study's entrance, his presence as silent and inevitable as a shadow at dusk. He carried a crystalline data slate, its surface dark and inert, and a weighted stylus of polished obsidian. He did not look at Ilara, but placed the items on a small, severe table of dark wood that had been moved near her chair. The gesture was formal, almost ceremonial. It was the presentation of a scribe's tools or a headsman's axe. "The Imperial Scriptorium has calibrated the slate to your biometric signature," Kalen stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "Only you may commit the text. It will be recorded as a singular, indelible act of authorship." Valerius had turned his attention back to the star chart, its cold light bathing his profile in a ghostly luminescence. "The first wave of Zealand scouts was detected at the edge of the Tartarus Nebula 3 cycles ago," he said, almost to himself. The statement was not for her benefit, not truly. It was the verbalization of the immense pressure that drove all this, a reminder of the fire at the Empire's back. "Their advance is faster than our models predicted. Your work is timely." He did not dismiss her. He simply returned to the war, leaving her in the custody of his prefect. The audience was over. Her new function had begun. Ilara stood, her movements stiff. She took the stylus. It was heavy, its cold seeping into her skin, a physical anchor to the abstract weight of her task. She did not look at the Emperor again as Kalen escorted her from the room. The corridor beyond was the same stretch of granite and burnished steel, but it felt different. Before, she had been a prisoner under interrogation. Now, she was an asset being managed. Back in the scriptorium wing, the gilded cage felt more like a cell than ever. The silence was no longer a space for thought, but a chamber that amplified the scratching of the obsidian stylus against the crystalline slate. She sat not at the comfortable reading chair, but at the stark desk, the tools of her complicity laid out before her. She began to write. The words did not flow. Each one was quarried from the depths of her training, shaped by the cold chisel of legal precedent, and placed with the agonizing precision of a stonemason building a tomb. She was not writing a justification. She was crafting a shield against a greater devastation, and the shield itself was a sorrow. She started with the foundation, citing the oldest laws of imperial unity, the very charters that had first bound the disparate realms into a single polity. She referenced the Concordance of Antares, the foundational promise of mutual defense that predated even the Oath of the Veils. Her argument was an architecture of logic, building layer by layer, leading the reader not to a conclusion of imperial greed, but of grim, unavoidable necessity. Then came the heart of the document, the doctrine of sovereign exigency. She articulated it not as a loophole, but as a dormant, terrible mechanism embedded within the state's very soul, designed for an hour of ultimate peril. Therefore, in accordance with the doctrine of sovereign exigency, a principle coeval with the empire's founding compact, which recognizes the state's primary, immutable duty of self-preservation against existential threats that would nullify all other laws and oaths by virtue of universal annihilation. She paused, her own words chilling her. Universal annihilation. She was wielding fear as a legal instrument. Finally, she came to the compromise she had won. She wrote the clause that suspended, not nullified, the Treaty of the Veils. She framed it as a temporary warding, a measure to gird the empire's weakest flank until the storm had passed. The privileges, autonomies, and oaths enshrined in the millennial Treaty of the Outer Veils are hereby placed in a state of sovereign suspension. All administrative and military authority reverts to the imperial throne, to be exercised by its appointed agents for the sole and express purpose of planetary defense. This mandate shall remain in effect only until the Zealand threat is neutralized, at which point the terms of the aforementioned treaty shall be fully and immediately restored, their authority reaffirmed by imperial decree. She wrote the final line, her own name inscribed at the bottom. Authored by Ilara Vane, archivist under Imperial command. The title was a pathetic attempt to signal her lack of choice, a distinction no one in the Veils would care to make. It was a masterpiece of rhetorical violence, cloaked in the calm, dispassionate language of the law. It gave the emperor his power, but it bound him publicly to a promise of restoration. It was everything he had asked for, and everything she had dreaded. It was finished. For a long time, she simply stared at the completed text, its letters glowing with a soft white light against the dark slate. It was a perfect, terrible thing. Her question in the Hall of Unification had been a spark of defiance. This proclamation was a chain forged from that same fire. She summoned the guard with a touch of the door's internal panel. When Kalen arrived, she met him at the threshold, holding the slate. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask. "It is done," she said, her voice flat. Kalen took the slate from her. For the first time, his gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. In the depths of his impassive eyes, she saw not pity nor cruelty, but something akin to recognition. It was the look one soldier gives another after a battle, not of camaraderie, but of shared, grim experience. He had served the Emperor's will his entire life. She had just learned what it truly meant. "The Emperor will review it immediately," he said, and turned to leave. "Prefect," she called out, the words stopping him. He turned back, his posture unchanging. "The riots in the Vales," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Will this proclamation quell them?" Kaelin's expression did not soften. "No, archivist," he replied, his voice a blade of pure pragmatism. "It will legitimize the force required to crush them. Your work has given the Emperor's soldiers a clear, legal mandate. They will be grateful for its clarity." He left her then, the heavy door closing with a soft, definitive hiss. The sound sealed her in with the truth. She had not prevented bloodshed. She had only given it a legal name. She walked to the great window, looking out over the geometric precision of the Imperial gardens below. The gilded cage was no longer a prison. It was an office. Her old life, the quiet life of an archivist who believed in the immutable power of oaths, was over. It had been consumed, repurposed by the cold, overarching logic of the empire she had, in the end, chosen to save. The quill rested beside the vellum, its ink-stained tip a black punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had rewritten her soul. The document lay on the polished surface of the desk, a thing of terrible and perfect legality. It was not a capitulation. It was a contract, a piece of sophisticated juridical architecture designed to build a cage around a lesser catastrophe to ward off an absolute one. Each letter, immaculately formed by her own hand, felt like a stone laid in the foundation of a new, colder world. The proclamation of Imperial mandate was complete. Ilara did not move. To touch the document now felt like a profanation, and to look away, a cowardice. The silence in her gilded rooms, once a smothering blanket of isolation, had acquired a new quality. It was the silence of a vacuum, the absolute stillness that follows the expenditure of a great force. She had poured her integrity, her name, and the moral authority she had accidentally won into that sheet of vellum. The room and her life within it felt hollowed out, an echoing chamber where her principles used to be. Her gaze drifted to her hands, resting on the dark wood of the desk. They looked the same, slender, scholarly, the fingers faintly smudged with the residue of her work. Yet they felt alien, instruments that had just signed away the freedom of a people who had looked to her as a symbol of hope. She had not been defeated by the Emperor's power, but co-opted by his logic. He had not broken her. He had repurposed her. It was a far more profound violation. The air grew dense, a subtle shift that heralded an arrival. The door opened without a sound, and Prefect Kaelin stepped inside. He moved with the same frictionless efficiency as always, his gray tunic seeming to absorb the light. His eyes, the color of wet slate, fell first on Ilara, then on the proclamation. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. There was only the placid finality of a task nearing completion. He stopped before the desk, a respectful distance away, his posture an unnerving blend of subordinate and warden. "The document is prepared," he stated. It was not a question. Ilara inclined her head, a minute motion that cost her a universe of effort. "It is." Kaelin extended a gloved hand. The gesture was impersonal, that of a courier collecting a dispatch. But in the charged space between them, it was the final, binding act of the transaction. For a sickening moment, her fingers refused to obey. The vellum seemed fused to the wood, a permanent monument to her compromise. Then, with the slow, deliberate motion of a priestess placing a sacrifice upon an altar, she slid the proclamation across the desk. It moved with a soft, rasping sound, the only noise in the tomb-like quiet. His fingers closed over it. He did not read it. He had no need. He trusted her precision as the emperor trusted his own authority. He rolled the document with an expert's care, his movements economical and swift, and slid it into a burnished metal cylinder he carried at his belt. The click of the cylinder's cap locking into place was as loud and irrevocable as a cell door slamming shut. "Your service to the Empire is noted," Kalen said, his voice flat, devoid of praise or judgment. He then placed a thin, leather-bound folio on the desk where the proclamation had been. "The Emperor believed this would be of interest to you. Preliminary intelligence on the Xylan ascendancy, threat analysis, and recorded fleet compositions." Ilara stared at the folio. It was an answer to a question she had not dared to ask, a confirmation of her new reality. She was no longer just the author of the mandate. She was being drawn into the core of the crisis that necessitated it. This was not a reward. It was a chain, forged of information, binding her more tightly to the Emperor's cause. She was being given the knowledge that justified her actions, a constant reminder of the abyss she had helped the Empire step back from. "My role is to read?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "Your role is to understand," Kalen corrected, a flicker of something almost like instruction in his tone. "The Emperor values clarity. You provide it." With that, he turned and was gone. The door closed, and the vacuum-like silence rushed back in, now tainted with the metallic scent of the cylinder he had carried. Her eyes were fixed on the leather folio. Threat analysis. Fleet compositions. The words were sterile, clinical, but they spoke of the end of worlds. Her scholarly mind, trained to parse ancient histories and legal precedents, was now to be aimed at an existential enemy. She was a weapon, and she was being calibrated. Hours passed. The gilded cage remained a cage, but its purpose had shifted. It was no longer a place of mere containment, but a laboratory. The folio lay before her, unopened. To open it was to accept the transition, to fully step into the role Valerius had crafted for her. She was Ilara Vane, the state's logician, the moral ballast for an act of brutal pragmatism. The sun began its descent, casting long geometric shafts of bruised purple and blood-orange light across the floor. The sounds from the palace grounds changed. The measured tread of the ceremonial guard had been replaced by a different rhythm, a harder, more urgent cadence. It was the sound of marching legions, the clatter of steel, and the low rumble of supply wagons. The proclamation was being enacted. The machine was moving. Later, a servant entered to bring her evening meal. She was a young woman Ilara had seen before, one whose quiet deference had always been tinged with a shy warmth. Tonight, there was nothing. The woman moved with a brittle, careful precision, her face a mask of impenetrable neutrality. She placed the tray on a side table, the silver clinking softly against the wood. She did not look at Ilara, not once. As she turned to leave, Ilara spoke, her own voice startling her. "Is your family well?" The servant froze, her back to Ilara. The stillness was a physical blow. For a long second, she said nothing. When she finally answered, her voice was a ghost, stripped of all inflection. "They are in the Vales, archivist." She used the old title, archivist, not a name, a function, a thing from before. The word hung in the air between them, a shard of ice. Then the woman departed, leaving Ilara alone with her meal and the cold, heavy knowledge that the first casualty of her service was the hope she had given to people like this. Her name was no longer a prayer on their lips. It was a curse. She did not eat. She sat in the gathering dark and imagined the proclamation being read in the town squares of the outer Vales. She imagined her own name, a name of the Vales, attached to the words that declared their subjugation. She had saved the empire from Valerius's tyranny only to deliver a more potent, more legitimate form of it herself. The clause promising restoration, the single desperate victory she had clawed from the negotiation, felt like a phantom comfort, a legalistic whisper against the roar of assembling armies. Would Valerius even honor it? She had only his word, the word of a man who had proven himself willing to break the most sacred of oaths for the sake of his own definition of survival. She had built her logic on a foundation of his pragmatism, and it felt like building on sand. The folio on her desk seemed to pulse in the gloom. "Understand?" Kaelin had said. It was a command. She finally reached for it, her fingers tracing the tooled leather. This was her penance and her purpose now, to stare into the abyss that Valerius had shown her, to know the enemy, and in knowing, to continuously reaffirm the terrible necessity of her choice. As her hand rested upon it, the soft chime of a bell resonated through her chambers. It was not the bell for meals or the changing of the guard. It was a summons. A moment later, a page, his face pale and awed, appeared at her door. "Archivist Vane," he stammered, his eyes wide. "The Emperor requires your presence." Ilara rose, her limbs feeling heavy, ancient. "Where?" she asked, expecting to be led back to the Emperor's stark, private study. The page swallowed, his gaze darting nervously around the luxurious room as if seeing a ghost within it. "In the obsidian chamber, archivist," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Imperial War Council is in session."